Andrea, you're on mute.
Thank you, Michelle. I thanked everyone for joining us. Thank you so much for that. The most famous line of the pandemic, I think, for many of us. Aloha and welcome. And I just wanted to welcome everyone today to the 35th Annual Experts at the Cathedral Lecture Series. My name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. I want to mahalo our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam, the curator and coordinator of the Expert Series. Dr. Kam is a lecturer with the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program, American Studies Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. HHF is very pleased to co-sponsor this series, and this year in collaboration with the 175th anniversary of the construction of Washington Place, the lectures explore 6 residences that are significant to the life of Queen Lili uokalani. Today's presenter will speak about Washington Place. Just a note that all of the lectures are being recorded and also live streamed on the HHF YouTube and Facebook pages, where they may be viewed and shared afterwards. Please type your questions throughout the lecture in the chat box on the Zoom menu bar as they arise. Our speaker will respond to them during the Q&A portion at the end, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can. We'd be grateful if you can take a moment to complete the brief survey that will pop up when you log off at the end of today's presentation. For those new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit that helps people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. And we do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. We are now honored to welcome a very special guest, First Lady Dawn Amano-Ige, who will introduce today's speaker. Dawn Amano-Ige became the First Lady of Hawaii in December 2014, when her husband, Governor David Ige, was sworn in as the 8th governor of the state of Hawaii. In her role as First Lady, Mrs. Ige draws on her experiences as an educator and businesswoman. Her educational background includes having served as Vice Principal of Konoalani Elementary School and Moanalua High School. Prior to working in school administration, Mrs. Ige was a 3rd grade teacher for over 10 years at Waimalu Elementary School. She supports education, particularly in the areas of literacy, global education, and international student exchanges. Mrs. Ige previously worked in business as marketing director of Kapiolani Healthcare System and as an account executive for the public relations firm of Stryker Weiner Associates. In 2019, Mrs. Ige created the Ohana Readers Program to promote early literacy among young children. During the pandemic, Mrs. Ige launched her Facebook page to connect with families and provide them with educational and recreational activities. The First Lady is also on a mission to encourage students and members of the community toward healthy living through the Jumpstart Breakfast Initiative and the Department of Health's Choose Healthy Now program. Mrs. Ige was born and raised in Ewa, Hawaii, and is a graduate of James Campbell High School in Ewa Beach. She received her bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Hawaii, where she met her husband. She also earned a master's degree in business from Chaminade University in Honolulu. After having...
Oh no. So is she frozen for everyone or just?
I just got a text from Andrea and her computer cut off. So I think that Mrs. Ige, if you would like to start introducing Rianna and the anniversary of Washington Place, that'd be great. So I'm going to stop my screen share. Thank you.
Ready? Aloha, everyone, and thank you, Andrea. That was a wonderful introduction. I want to thank Dr. Ralph Kim of the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program at UH Manoa and Kirsten Faulkner from the Historic Hawaii Foundation for organizing the 2022 Expert Lecture Series on the residences of Queen Liliuokalani. 2022 marks the 175th anniversary of Washington Place, and today's event is the first event for the anniversary celebration. So congratulations and thank you to all of you. As you will learn in the next hour, this historic home, Washington Place, is best known as the home of Hawaii's beloved Queen Liliuokalani, who resided at this residence for 55 years. The 175th anniversary of Washington Place will help us showcase the home, its history, and its residents. The Office of Governor, together with a committee of many community leaders, have scheduled events to recognize the home. These events include a new exhibit right here at Washington Place on Queen Liliuokalani, as well as a Royal Hawaiian Band concert, open house, and even a special hula presentation by Hawaii's public school fourth graders. It'll be a simultaneous hula event honoring the Queen and the home. These activities will take place in late March and early April at Washington Place. And I hope all of you will be able to join us as we recognize the historical significance of this home. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Rianna Williams as your expert speaker today. Rianna Williams is an independent historian specializing in the Hawaiian monarchy period. She has been a docent at Iolani Palace and has served as a docent at Washington Place for 15 years. And I personally have learned so much from her. She did research for and was mentored by H.J. Jim Bartels. She has written 4 books, including the book titled Queen Liliuokalani, the Dominis Family, and Washington Place, Their Home. Rianna has transcribed and indexed the diaries of Queen Emma, Queen Liliuokalani, and the letters of Charles Reed Bishop for the Bishop Museum. In 2002, she was honored by the Foundation for Hawaii's Women's History and the Alulike Native Hawaiian Library. Rianna, thank you for all your hard work and service to perpetuate the Queen's vision for Washington Place. I know for myself and all the visitors who have been on your tour, we enjoy your stories, your information, and your love for Washington Place. So for all of you today, please enjoy today's lecture with Rianna, and I look forward to seeing all of you once again at Washington Place. Mahalo. Rianna?
Thank you, Mrs. Ige, and also I want to thank you for proposing the idea of this series honoring the Queen's many homes. So today, Washington Place, the stately Greek Revival style home next to St. Andrew's Cathedral, a rare 19th century house still standing, the official home of Queen Liliuokalani, a home that has been and still is a hub of Honolulu social and political life for 175 years. But first, let's have some basic historical background. It was built by Liliuokalani's eventual father-in-law, Captain John Dominis, a highly respected ship captain, originally from Trieste. It's not clear when he first arrived in America, but he became an American citizen in 1825. He mostly sailed between Canton, China, and the American East Coast, selling in America what were then considered exotic wares: lacquer, silks, spices, porcelain, camphor wood items, and Chinese-style furniture. He and his wife, Mary, and their son, John Owen Dominis, aged 5, arrived permanently in Honolulu in 1837. They left 2 older daughters with family in Boston for their continued education. But sadly, Both girls died within the next 4 years, each around the age of 13, never again having seen their parents or brother. The captain continued his sailing and selling life and started building his dream house in Honolulu in the mid-1840s. Unfortunately, another sad event, he never got to live in it. In 1846, the year before the completion of the house, while a passenger on a ship going to China to purchase items for the home, the ship and everyone aboard were lost at sea, possibly in a typhoon in the South China Sea. Everyone and the ship never heard of again. Captain Dominis was only 49 years old. At the time of the building of the house, the surrounding area was a hot, dry, dusty plains area with horses and cattle roaming around. There were taro patches between there and Diamond Head, and a marshy landfill across the road from the house. But the house had a wonderful view to Honolulu Harbor, which at the time was closer to Queen Street. Standing at the front door, one could see ships arriving in the harbor. And conversely, those aboard the ships could see an elegant white 2-story house set in the middle of nowhere. There was only one other Western-style house of equal value nearby, that of Dr. Robert W. Wood, at the present corner of Bishop and Hotel Streets, which was torn down in 1900 to make way for the Alexander Young Hotel. And that was demolished in the early 1980s to make way for today's Tamarin Square. Captain Dominis's purchase of the land, mainly facing Beretania Street, was a complicated situation as the land was part of a grant awarded by Hawaiian chiefs to the British consulate in 1825 to provide the consulate a permanent location. And by the way, Beretania is the Hawaiian way of saying Britain. However, Richard Charlton, the British consul at the time, was involved in several lawsuits against the Hawaiian government, creating much tension. Nevertheless, Dominis managed to purchase most of the property in 1840. Originally 1.46 acres, today the property is 3.31 acres, thanks to later purchases. William Miller, the British consul after Charlton, and for whom Miller Street is named, lived in a small adobe house on the corner of Punch Bowl and Beretania Streets from 1844 to 1861. Dominis bought the corner property from Miller in 1845. Now, as for the construction of the house, there were no official architects in Honolulu at the time, the 1840s, but there were quite a few skilled craftsmen who did the work of building the home. The house has a coral stone foundation, the coral quarried directly from the ocean, a wood frame, Tuscan columns, a 2-story veranda, originally 4 rooms on the ground floor, and originally 4 rooms and a central hall or parlor on the 2nd floor. There is a low basement with a brick floor, early on used as a cellar as it was so cool inside. The captain's good friend, Captain Charles Brewer, was in America at the time and acted as Dominis's agent, purchasing items for the house, such as doorknobs and glass windows. Many of the materials, lumber, window glass, nails, door frames, came by ship from Boston around Cape Horn. At one point, Captain Brewer wrote to Dominis saying that he, Brewer, had purchased a front door for the house, and Dominis was going to have the fanciest front door in the city. Today, the glass surrounding the door is still original. A large room called the glass lanai on the east end of the original square house was added in 1921. After the captain's disappearance, his widow, Mary, suddenly had no income, but she and their son, John Owen Dominis, now age 14, were able to keep the house by renting rooms to high-class people, such as local lawyers and various businessmen passing through the city. And that's the way it stayed, a boarding house for the next 15 years. Some of the now open first floor rooms originally had walls and doors, allowing needed privacy for the renters. In time, young John Owen married a Hawaiian woman, an important subject I'll come back to. Have you ever wondered how a large, stately, almost Southern-style home on an island in the Pacific Ocean carries the name of Washington Place? It's thanks to a man named Anthony Tenike, who rented a room in the home and established the U.S. legation in the home in 1847. A legation is a diplomatic mission just below an embassy. That was when the American flag was first raised in the front yard. In 1848, on the 116th anniversary of U.S. President George Washington's birth, Tenike wrote a letter to Hawaii Minister of Foreign Affairs, Robert Crichton Wiley, stating that with the permission of Mrs. Dominis, he, Tenike, had christened the house Washington Place after their joint American president. King Kamehameha III responded by not only agreeing to the name, but actually commanded that the house go by the name of Washington Place for all time. The American flag supposedly continued to fly at the house until Mary's death in 1889, when the new lady of the house, Lili uokalani, removed it. Another lodger was William Little Lee, an American who helped draft the kingdom's legal system, later becoming the first Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court. His wife, Catherine, lived there with him. The original kitchen was in back of the property, separate from the house, for fire and odor reasons. Over time, 4 wells were dug on the property. There was a large ceramic tiled bathhouse containing a tub, a toilet, and a sink, also on the back of the property, plus some kind of structure used as servants' quarters. The home had an indoor bathroom adjacent to the Queen's bedroom, apparently installed in the latter half of the 19th century. And the home was electrified in 1899-1900, 12 years after Iolani Palace. A formal parlor on the ground floor got heavy use by Mary, as she made a point of entertaining ship captains and foreign traders passing through the kingdom, always hoping to learn something about her husband, although she never did. She left a lantern burning on the front gate at night in case he returned. In the 1860s, she was also interested in American events, as she had 2 nephews fighting in what was called the War Between the States, the American Civil War. Another room on the ground floor that received much use is the room now called the Blue Room. During Mary's time, it was a dining room where outsiders could enjoy a dinner out in a nice surrounding for a set fee, giving Mary additional needed income to keep the house going. Mary Dominis is credited with making the first real garden, a combination of indigenous and imported plants, in Honolulu soon after moving into Washington Place, turning an arid wasteland into what friends called a paradise of the Pacific. A 1895 Pacific Commercial Advertiser article reads, "Old residents who knew her at that period of her life always picture her in their memory as carrying a water pot in one hand and a garden trowel in the other." I stress the word arid in describing the area. So how was this garden made, and how did it thrive without piped water? Well, water was taken from the property wells in buckets and hauled hand over hand, Mary spending hours every day taking care of her beloved plants. Years later, her daughter-in-law would also enjoy spending hours tending to the garden. Other areas of the city without piped water purchased water from Hawaiian men who brought water in huge containers down from Nu'uanu Valley, pulling them along on large wood carts. Mary, having her own wells, would have found it much more convenient. She planted beds of colorful flowers along with ferns and trees, many of the seedlings no doubt sent to her by family and friends in America, and also brought to her by her husband's ship captain friends. In recent years, original plants have been replicated as much as possible, sponsored by the Washington Place Foundation, with help from the Garden Club of Hawaii, female inmates from the Hawaii Correctional Industries Organization, and many community volunteers. Mary is also credited with hosting the first Christmas at Washington Place in 1858. On Christmas Eve that year, 100 children were invited to an evening event where they were surprised by the sound of sleigh bells outside the front of the house. Soon a man dressed in a red costume, introduced as Santa Claus, appeared and distributed small gifts to each child. This was followed by a banquet for adults, and a proper church service was held in the parlor the next day. But let's move on to the main residence of the home. Mary Dominis was a white, strong-willed, middle-class Bostonian woman, one of 6 daughters among 8 children. Her father was described as both a mariner and a laborer, her mother, no doubt, a housewife. Moving across the world to an island in the Pacific Ocean did not change Mary much. She decorated her home with typical New England furniture, and most likely her only contact with Hawaiian people was with servants and laborers. I've talked a bit about her son, John Owen, but let me add a few comments about him. Although he didn't really take to school, he was sometimes a problem. He was anyway a popular youth. He attended several nearby schools, but there is no record of his graduating from any of them. It was while attending the English language Oahu Charity School next door to the Hawaiian Chief's Children's School, attended by the Ali'i children, that he and Liliu first noticed each other. John somehow went on to attend the Chief's Children's School, where teacher Amos Starr Cook wrote in 1844, "Today I had quite a talk with John before dinner, and he said he would try to be a good boy." As an adult, John was a man's man who enjoyed horses and shooting and held numerous government positions, such as secretary to both King Kamehameha IV and King Kamehameha V. He was a member of the Privy Council and the House of Nobles. He was governor of Maui for 9 years and governor of Oahu for 23 years until his death in 1891. In the year 2001, I read and condensed over 400 letters connected to the Dominis family in the Hawaii State Archives for historian Jim Bartels. Several letters allude to John's affairs while single, and I am positive he fathered a child by a Hawaiian woman before his marriage to Liliu, although he apparently had nothing to do with the child. John Owen Dominis, age 30, and Lydia Kamakaeha Paki, age 24, were married on September 16, 1862, at the home of Charles Reed Bishop and his wife, Bernice Pauahi. She went by her Christian name of Lydia to her friends and family for many years, not becoming Lili uokalani until 1877 at the age of 39, when her brother, King Kalakaua, made her heir apparent and gave her the name before he left on his trip around the world. It was a name she supposedly did not like. The bride and groom lived in Washington Place with John's mother, Mary. All was not pleasant for Liliu there, as Mary continued her stiff formal ways, such as chastising Liliu for cutting flowers from the garden. Mary saying it was her garden and her flowers. Mary was also apparently not keen on her daughter-in-law's dark skin color, though in truth, she and her son were so close, she probably would not have liked anyone her precious son married. Over time, it was not a happy marriage. Liliu wrote in her diaries that John did not stand up to his mother on her behalf, that John often drank too much. Liliu abhorred drinking and often didn't show up at events he was supposed to. Her written comments often include complaints about his constant and boring stories, and she was also always surprised on the rare occasion he gave her a gift. She also complained that sermons given at both Kauai and Kamankapili churches were boring and tedious, so she would leave early. Some days she preferred to garden rather than attend church. She wrote that she felt guilty about it, but did it anyway. Before leaving John Owen Dominis, I must mention a 1891 letter I found in our state archives from American minister John L. Stevens to James G. Blaine, U.S. Secretary of State, informing Blaine of Dominis's death. The final sentence reads, "By his associates, he, Dominis, has been regarded amiable in character and of strong American sympathies." That is a bombshell comment about the Queen's husband. But back to Washington Place, Liliu had a small 2-room private cottage on the property called Hinano Bower, which allowed her to get away from both her mother-in-law and her husband, and also allowed her to speak privately to personal and political friends. In the 1990s, I transcribed 13 years of Liliu's diaries onto the computer at Bishop Museum Archives. According to her diary, she spent a lot of time in her cottage, often spending the night. Numerous years ago, when I was touring Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, New York, the docent told a story that immediately made me think of Queen Lili uokalani. The Roosevelt marriage was also unhappy, partly due to Franklin's affairs, but also to his mother Sarah running roughshod over Eleanor, reminiscent of Mary and Liliu. When Franklin died and the house went to Eleanor, she immediately moved out and turned it over to the National Park Service, saying she didn't want it. She never felt like she belonged there, and it held too many unhappy memories. Liliu also wrote she sometimes felt like an intruder in her own home, but nevertheless, when John Owen Dominis died and the house went to Liliu, she kept it, turning it into a gracious, warm, and welcoming home to family, friends, and strangers. A home in which the Hawaiian culture was to be perpetuated, mainly through music and dance, which was still happening prior to the present COVID pandemic. The Washington Place Foundation has sponsored many Hawaiian events and encouraged Hawaiian organizations to use the home. After having had several strokes, Queen Lili uokalani died on November 11th, 1917, at Washington Place in her own bed, in her then downstairs front corner bedroom, with her small dog Pony laying nearby. During her last days, hundreds of people gathered in front of the home, chanting and praying. Upon her death, the royal standard was raised and immediately lowered to half-mast, a sign of respect and mourning. Flags were also lowered to half-mast at government and public buildings, while bells tolled at both St. Andrew's Cathedral and Kaiahao Church. Her funeral procession from Iolani Palace, then called the Executive Building, to Mauna Ala, the Royal Mausoleum in Nu'uanu, over 2 miles, had an estimated 40,000 people watching from every possible vantage point, including hanging out of windows and standing or sitting in trees. At the end of the service, all was over, a funeral, a monarchy, and a way of life never to be seen again in Hawaii nei. Only sadness reigned, just as it had in 1893. Wails of "Pau Lili uokalani" resounded off the nearby mountains. Before I leave the Queen and move on to the resident governors, I want to mention local lawyer William O. Smith. Born in Koloa, Kauai, he was at one time Attorney General for the Provisional Government, President of the Hawaii Bar Association, and a prime planner in the overthrow of the monarchy as a member of the Committee of Safety, or Committee of 13. Nevertheless, in 1909, Liliu appointed Smith her lawyer in setting up the Liliuokalani Trust, whose mission is to help Hawaiian children in various ways, and also made him one of the 3 trustees of her trust. Why would she choose such a person? Because he was reputed to have been the best lawyer in Honolulu, and that was what she wanted, no matter his past actions against her. But what's important in the situation is what lawyer Smith later said about the Queen. We saw her greatness after all of the trouble was over. Her true greatness was in her ability to forgive. And she was a fine enough person not to let past differences, very great differences, stand in the way of friendship for some who had opposed her. As I mentioned earlier, John Owen Dominis, the Queen's husband, was governor of Oahu and Maui. But what of the 19 governors that followed him? Only 12 of them actually lived in Washington Place. If you visit the house today, you'll see on the 2nd floor informative large storyboards about many of them, put together by our former curator, Cynthia Engel. The 4 governors after Governor Dominis did not live in the house, mainly due to the legislature deciding what to do with the house. The monarchy was over. The Queen had died in 1917. Why do we need this big, expensive house? We should just tear it down because that's what you do with old houses. Well, thankfully, the Queen's nephew, Prince Kuhio, stepped in and lobbied that the house be kept in the Queen's memory. The legislature finally agreed. So in 1918, Governor Charles J. McCarthy, appointed by President Woodrow Wilson, moved in. However, just as Captain Dominis purchasing the original land was complicated, the territory of Hawaii purchasing the house was also complicated. There were many legalities and people involved, centering on land surveys, appraisals, and heirs. So when Governor McCarthy moved in 1918, he did so as a private citizen, renting the house on his own because he didn't want to have to move again if the legislature finally made a decision to keep the house as a governor's home. A personal story we like to tell about Governor McCarthy is that along with the white suits he generally wore, every day he wore in his lapel a fresh 5-petal coral hibiscus flower representing his 5 daughters. So when all was said and done, Washington Place was officially purchased by the territory of Hawaii in 1921 for $35,000, or over $400,000 or $500,000 today, depending on which financial source you read. Some governors had difficulties living in the house. During the time of Lawrence Macaulay Judd, 1929 to 34, there was a Honolulu gas company garage and warehouse on Punchbowl Street, not far from the home's kitchen and dining room. The sounds of workmen hammering on metal tanks often drowned out the weighty remarks of a diplomat or statesman visiting the home. In 1953, Pauline King, wife of Governor Samuel Wilder King, was dismayed at the worn Lahala mats, the termite-ridden rattan furniture, and the unsteady foundations. After her shoe heel went through the dining room floor and mounds of termite droppings were discovered underneath, renovations were quickly done. Beatrice Burns, wife of Governor John A. Burns, masterminded a garden rejuvenation in the 1960s while in a wheelchair due to adult polio. After its completion, she discovered there was no budget for maintenance. So after the governor came home at 11 p.m. at night, he would go out and water the garden. The house was eventually deemed important enough to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1973 and described as a National Historic Landmark in 2007. The latter designation is a rare honor as it was awarded based on a person, Queen Lili uokalani, rather than the actual building, which has been too compromised to fit the usual criteria due to many renovations over many years. Our last three governors have also not lived in Washington Place, but in the new house next door. While living in Washington Place, First Lady Vicky Cayetano in 1999 founded the Washington Place Foundation, the object being to build a new modern governor's home and turn Washington Place into a museum, a feat she accomplished mainly through private donations. The new two-story home was built on a corner of the property in 2002. Before the COVID pandemic, Washington Place was often used for both private and public meetings and events, which can hopefully eventually happen again. Weekly free public tours are now starting up again. There are many stories about the home and its occupants, so please do come and visit. For current tour information, visit the Washington Place website. I guarantee you'll enjoy every minute of your visit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rianna. Ralph, if you would like to turn on your thank you, and just a word to everyone, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat.
Well, until we get a question, may I say something else? Many of you who work downtown have walked by the front of the house, and perhaps you've noticed in the corner, somewhat set back, an Aloha Oi plaque. This was from 1929 when Albert Pierce Taylor, a librarian at the archives, wanted this put in the Queen's memory. But what's interesting is it was all done by personal donations, but people were only allowed to donate $1 per person to give everyone a chance to donate. So next time you walk by the front of the house, stop and look at the Aloha Oi plaque. Most people just don't pay any attention.
My question is, what was the
Okay.
most surprising finding that you've had concerning Washington Place?
During Washington Place versus the Queen, I guess one of the things, and it's not, I don't know how to answer that without thinking about it. Because I went into Washington Place knowing practically nothing. So everything I learned was surprising, amazing, and wonderful. But let me just mention General Miller, who I've mentioned, for Miller Street, right around the corner. He was from England, and he fought in the War of 1812 in Washington, D.C., helping to burn down the White House. And then when he came here, he sided with Consul Charlton about land claims against his government. So he was a very unpopular person. I guess that's not so surprising when you're dealing with so many people. There are going to be a lot who are unpopular. If I may skip the question on to the Queen versus Washington Place, the most amazing, and this is an odd word to use, exciting thing I found about the Queen was in reading her diaries. There have always been questions that although she denied 3 children, and she dearly loved children, she never gave birth to any children. She never was pregnant. Why was that? People have often wondered. Well, I discovered in her own handwriting, in her 1886 diary, she had just been to a doctor. She was told she had a physical deformity, which meant an almost complete closing of her womb. She could have normal sexual relations, but she simply could not become pregnant. This could have happened at birth. It could have happened after an accident. It could have happened after a urinary infection. So I was amazed, and I felt very proud of myself to say, I know now what nobody else knows, but it's in my book. So if you read my book, you'll know all about it. But it was a very long time intriguing question to historians. So I was happy to fill that question in.
We have a question about the standard that was flown in front of the house. Would Washington Place fly the Royal Hawaiian Standard or the Monarch of Hawaii Standard?
Today? You mean today?
No, on special days. When
No, not to my knowledge. No, it's strictly the American flag, the state flag. And at one time during the governor's period, the governor's flag would fly when they were in residence, and then when there happened to be a lot of, I don't know how to say this because I have forgotten the exact words, a lot of dangerous things going on in America, I guess. With politicians, they decided to stop flying the governor's flag, whether the governor was in residence or not in residence. And I think that's done pretty much across the country. Mrs. Ige might know more about that. I've just forgotten the exact details. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can add to that answer. Rianna, you're right. There is a flag, a governor's flag. Right now it's out flying. It's flying all the time now. After 9/11, at one point the flag flew when the governor was in town, and it was put away when the governor was out of town. But after 9/11 and for security reasons, the flag is flown all the time.
Thank you. See, I have white hair and I can't remember everything. Mrs. Ige is much younger than I am. She can remember these things.
Rianna, I learned it all from you.
Another question, was there a catalog ever done of the numerous plants that were grown over the years?
There is a handwritten document by Queen Lili uokalani that lists every plant, tree, bush, flower on the property, but unfortunately she did not date it. So we don't have a date, but we have a list of many of the plants. And that's how the foundation has been able to recently start replicating some of those original plants. I know she had planted banyan, pili nut trees, strawberry guava, mountain apple, oranges, breadfruit, plumeria, tea, magnolia, and right outside the front door, there's a big tamarind tree. About 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, right outside the front door, as you go up the front walkway, one of the major trees next to the sidewalk, which supposedly started in the 1840s, we had a terrible rainstorm. The tree fell over completely. The entire bottom came up out of the ground, lifting up part of the cement staircase. They could not save the tree, but what they did was they saved 2 large pieces of the tree trunk in case someday some person would like to make a piece of furniture or something for the house in remembrance of that longtime tree from the 1840s.
Rianna, can I add to that?
Sure, please do.
I just put in the chat, that list that the Queen wrote. It is found in the Hawaii State Archives, and
Yes.
it's digitized now, so it's available to the public. You can also find a copy of that list on the washingtonplace.gov website under Tours and Gardens.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's just too bad it wasn't dated.
Yes, yes.
So, Rianna, you talked about the wells on the property. Are
dear.
any of them still active?
I have no idea. Nobody has ever mentioned them. Do you know anything, Mrs. Ige? I certainly don't know.
It's the first time I've heard of it just today, so it makes me want to go look for the wells. And if I find it, I will share it with the Historic Hawaii Foundation.
I know one was under a hedge, and that's all I can remember.
I will look for them.
But I don't think I really knew exactly where they were. The story was just 4 wells, period.
So knowing the Board of Water Supply, I'm sure they're capped.
Well, I would hope so, yes.
Do you know of any time capsules on the property?
No, I've never heard of that.
Well, in fact, there is a proposal to do a time capsule for the 175th anniversary celebration. So
That's a good idea.
So maybe for the next 100 years, we may have one.
Good, good.
We have a question. What is the name of your book?
Queen Lili uokalani, the Dominis family, and Washington Place, their home.
And where is it available?
Amazon is probably the easiest. It's sometimes available at certain museums around town. It just depends on how many they sell and if they reorder and when they do that. So Best Press puts it out. You can also buy it from Best Press directly on their Harding Avenue store in Kaimuki, and they will mail it to you also.
Okay. Did the Queen will Washington Place to anyone?
She left it to her Hanai son, Aimoku, had died. So the house, I guess, kind of went to her daughter-in-law, whose name escapes me. Her maiden name was McInerney, and I can't think of her first name. But some of that information is murky, and it's hard to really figure everything out. She didn't stay, she left. So I think that maybe the Queen didn't do it correctly, or the woman didn't want it. Sybil McInerney. So it didn't go to her in the sense that she and her kids moved in it. She just left, and then the house sat until Kuhio tried to get it saved, which he did.
Another question, do you have any insight into why John chose to marry Liliu and why she accepted?
That's a good question, because when she describes herself as a young lady, she says she's not pretty, she's not rich, she doesn't own a lot of land, so she just kind of looks at herself in that way. And yet John Dominis was not a well-known person other than through his friends. John didn't have any money. John didn't have any land. Possibly she often wrote in her diary that she wondered if John really loved her. She loved him, but sometimes she questioned if he loved her. So who's to say why? you know, you could say that about people today too, that you probably know. Why did they marry each other? Who knows? It's just things that happen.
Did the lawsuits by Prince Kohio against the Queen's Trust involve control of Washington Place?
The lawsuits, a control. I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
There was a lawsuit between Prince Kohio and the Liliuokalani Trust itself.
Yes.
And this is a question as to whether it involved Washington Place in those lawsuits.
I can only say that is not something I know a lot of details about, but it is nothing I have ever read, been told, learned about. I'm sorry.
If anyone further information about any of the questions you've given, Rianna has graciously said that if you send an email to her, she would be more than glad to answer it.
Yes, yes.
So you can forward that to the Historic Hawaii Foundation and they'll get the question to Rianna.
If I can make one more Miller comment, because it's kind of fun. General Miller, you know, lived around the corner. Dr. Straub of Straub Clinic also lived around the corner. And Berger lived there. And Dr. Straub made violins as a hobby. So often Dr. Straub, Henry Berger, and the Queen would go to Dr. Straub's house and they would have little musicales and play amongst themselves for an afternoon, as the Queen said, just forgetting the outside world. I think that's kind of a cute story.
It is. Another question, has the professional museum staffing model of having a curator or other paid professional historic site position been sustained, and will it remain current?
Probably that's for Mrs. Ige. When the Cayetanos were living there and Governor Cayetano was governor, they hired Jim Bartels, who became curator and director, all of that, which he did until his very unfortunate early death. And then since that time, they have hired various directors and curators. But technically, Mrs. Ige probably knows more about that than I do.
Yes,
about hiring people.
Yes, on our staff here at Washington Place, we do have a director and a curator, and those positions have continued since the Cayetano administration. So we have maintained that, and it is the curator's job to preserve the collections here, and the director's job to handle the repair and maintenance. In 2017, we did extensive renovations for safety and for access to the second floor of Washington Place. So now the second floor, since 2017, has been open for visitors to view and to take a look at. In the past, it was just for the private residents and the private rooms of the governors here, but now we do have exhibits on that. And we still consider Washington Place a historic home. It's always a home for all of us, especially those who have lived on the Washington Place property, and it is very meaningful to all of us to have the experience and the privilege and honor to be able to spend our time here.
Yes.
Rianna, other than the tree that fell, did they remove any other trees from the front yard that you know of?
No, not to my knowledge. They mostly what they've removed is just overgrowth of plants you don't want that got in there and are growing over other plants. So that's about all I know that they've removed.
Yes, Rianna, you're right. We've just done some just refreshing of the landscaping to add more of the native Hawaiian plants. And we looked at the Queen's list of plants that she wrote down. We added many of those kinds of plants. We just did that in the past from last spring till now. So we're very excited about that kind of regrowing and revitalization of the lawns and areas.
Okay. Rianna, the Queen's Diaries that you mentioned,
Yes.
interesting. Are they available in book form?
At Bishop Museum, I transcribed all of them onto the computer so that people could have a paper range of diaries to look at and not handle the originals. At the state archives, they have some different diaries. To my knowledge, it's just the diary that you get to look at with white gloves and a page turner. So the answer is kind of yes and no. It depends on what year you're looking for and which place you go to.
Bailey Martell has a link in the chat. So if anyone can go to the chat, you can see the link for Rihanna's book.
Yes, and I see down below David Forbes. Yes, he was doing very extensive work on the Queen's Diaries. And as you probably know, he just died a couple weeks ago. So, and I did see somebody ask what language they were in. They were all in English with just an occasional maybe sentence or phrase in Hawaiian, which were translated by someone many years ago in the state archives.
Okay, there's I guess a comment and a question. Interesting point about Washington Place's historic register nomination. The house has undergone some significant renovations in the past few years to restore its historic integrity. Perhaps the historic register nomination can be updated to reflect this. I know that many of the properties on Merchant Street have had their nomination updated. Do you know if there are any plans for updating Washington Place's nomination?
That's not anything I would know. Again, Mrs. Egan probably can answer that.
No, there's no plans for that, but certainly that's a wonderful suggestion. I think I'd like to look into maybe what we can do to update the nomination.
And really, we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Can you talk about her piano?
Oh gosh, her piano. It's a beautiful, beautiful piano. It was a gift to the Queen from, I think about 70 or something local businessmen. The logs to make the Pikoa piano were sent from the Big Island to New York to have this piano made for her. And it was a gift just to show their aloha to her. It stopped on being shipped, it stopped in California and was on public display for a while. Then it came here. It went to Iolani Palace, where she had a christening of the piano with a big party one evening. And then it was moved the next day to Washington Place. And unfortunately, a lot of those gifted people who gave her aloha were also instrumental later in overthrowing her. But it is a beautiful piano. It is kept in tune. It is kept in good shape. It's very, very valued to the house and very well taken care of. It's rarely played, but on occasion, I have seen someone play it at a particular event.
Perhaps Mrs. Ige can close out this period of questions. Could you provide more information about the tours of the house and the gardens?
We do have tours every Thursdays at 10 o'clock. And we are now, due to COVID, we have limited the size of the tours to just 4 people. We're hoping to increase it soon. But to sign up for the tours, which is a tour of the home, the first floor and the second floor, we're still working on tours of the garden, but you're welcome to walk through the gardens when you're here. You can sign up for tours on our WashingtonPlace.gov website. There's a drop-down menu that you can sign up, and we will schedule you for a tour. So please come and join us here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rianna. I'm going to turn it back to Andrea so she can close out our session today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rianna. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, much, Mrs. Ige, for joining us. And it was wonderful to have you answer many questions about Washington Place. And thank you, Dr. Cam, as always, for your insights and moderating the Q&A for us. I want to thank our audience, everyone who joined us. We have quite a few people, and we really hope that you enjoyed this very special presentation. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Michelle Kisik, also, who's been providing technical support, which was much appreciated when my computer shut down. So I apologize, Mrs. Ige, for shortchanging you on the last few lines of your introduction.
You did a wonderful job, no problem.
Oh, thank you so much. That was the first time that's ever happened, unfortunately. I also want to invite everyone to join us next Thursday, February 17th at noon for our next lecture, our third one, which will explore the history of the Queen's Retreat, Boyd House or Hedeman Estate. It's known as the place that inspired Aloha Oi and was a favorite resting place for the then princess. Our presenter will be Paul Brennan, who's president of the Kailua Historical Society. We also encourage you, if you're not already signed up for our HHF e-newsletter, you can do so at historichawaii.org. We really highlight a lot of wonderful presentations and events, and really the work that's being done by everyone in the community as well as by HHF. And a mahalo to our development director, Beth Iwata, for curating our e-news. And also please consider supporting Historic Hawaii Foundation in our work. If you're not already doing so by becoming a member or donating, you can visit the Join Us section at the historichawaii.org link to learn more. Finally, I just want to say a big mahalo to everyone for caring about historic places and stories and histories and keeping them alive and relevant in today's world. And congratulations to the Iges and to Washington Place for this momentous occasion of the 175th anniversary. There are many events. Mrs. Ige, I apologize. I think there's a website where people can go to learn more about the events, or is it on your regular website?
We'll be sending out press releases on that in the next month. We're still finalizing a few events, so look out for the information and we'll be sharing it with the community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So I just want to wish everyone good health, you and your families and loved ones. Keep your spirits bright and hope to see you next week. Ahui ho.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.